The 2008 financial crisis, the waves of migration in the mid-2010s, and the COVID pandemic all drove up the cost of living and eroded trust in European governments. As a result, the popularity of right-wing and far-right politicians surged, and for some, the temptation arose to romanticize the legacy of the Third Reich, which might seem appealing at first glance. They say that under Hitler, unemployment vanished, the economy grew, and after the chaos of the 1920s and the Great Depression, Germans finally found stability. But that view is dangerously shallow. In this episode, we'll explore whether the Nazis truly managed to rebuild the economy, how much genuine support they had among ordinary citizens and within Hitler's inner circle, and what went wrong in the Reich's military strategy. We'll also uncover how the so-called miracle after the Versailles Conference, Germany was forced to pay enormous reparations. Throughout the 1920s, the terms and amounts were revised twice, ultimately reduced by more than half. When the Great Depression struck, the United States granted a one-year moratorium on payments, and in the summer of 1932, the Lausanne Conference abolished reparations altogether. Germany was left only with the obligation to redeem bonds worth 3 billion marks, to be repaid over 15 years, with a 3-year grace period. But when Hitler became chancellor, he refused to pay even that. In the early 1930s, Hjalmar Schacht, a prominent financier and former head of the Reichsbank, became intrigued by Hitler's rhetoric, and the two grew close. Through Schacht, Hitler established connections with powerful industrialists and bankers, alliances that would later help secure his rise to the chancellorship. Once the Nazis took power, Schacht returned as head of the Reichsbank and devised a shadowy financial mechanism to fund rearmament, using MEFO bills to conceal state spending. A private company called Metallurgical Forschungsgesellschaft, or MEFO, was created to issue promissory notes used to secretly pay armament manufacturers. The MEFO bills paid interest, and manufacturers could either hold them or immediately exchange them for cash at banks. This system made it possible to conceal the true scale of military orders, since they didn't appear in the official state budget. The funding seemed to come from a private company. The result was a massive boost to the arms industry and a surge in employment. Through MEFO financing alone, Germany produced around 12 billion marks worth of military goods. But in reality, it was a financial pyramid, a temporary illusion of growth built on future debt. In 1933, new laws aimed at reducing unemployment were introduced. They allocated 1 billion marks for the construction of a nationwide Autobahn network, as well as for infrastructure repair, land reclamation, and other public works projects. Another step toward reducing unemployment was the introduction of mandatory 6-month labor service for young men, and later, after the outbreak of World War II, for young women as well. This provided the regime with an almost free labor force. One more major initiative was the 4-year plan, an accelerated program to mobilize the economy for war, led by Hermann Göring.
Under his command, Germany expanded arms production and invested heavily in related industries, metallurgy, chemicals, and synthetic fuel manufacturing. In the short term, these measures fueled rapid economic growth and lowered unemployment. But the progress came at a steep cost. It drained national resources and left the civilian sector neglected. Strategically, the four-year plan did not strengthen the economy. It made it increasingly fragile, creating deep structural imbalances. Between 1932 and 1938, heavy industry output soared by 200%, while the production of consumer goods rose only by 38%.
Starting in the late 1920s, Hitler's National Socialist Party, the NSDAP, began to steadily gain popularity. But to seize absolute power, the Nazis resorted to systematic manipulation, intimidation, and false accusations. We covered this story in detail in one of our earlier videos, and it's definitely worth watching. In short, there was never anything close to the mythical 90% support or true national unity that the Nazi propaganda claimed. Even within the party itself, Hitler's authority was far from absolute. If it had been, there would have been no need for the brutal internal purge known as the Night of the Long Knives, when at least 85 influential rivals from within his own ranks were killed. Some professionals weren't afraid to challenge him. For instance, Hjalmar Schacht, the same banker who once helped finance the regime, broke with Hitler even before the outbreak of World War II. He opposed the reckless military spending and later became one of the Reich's outspoken critics, predicting its collapse. Ordinary citizens, too, found ways to resist the Nazi regime. At the University of Munich, a group of students formed the White Rose, a resistance movement that spread anti-Nazi pamphlets and counter-propaganda. The group was eventually exposed. 6 members were executed and many others imprisoned. There were also individuals who, despite sharing some of the regime's early ideals, risked everything to save Jewish lives, hiding them or employing them in their factories to protect them from persecution. Acts of rescuing Jews were not isolated cases. But the most striking episode of German resistance was the assassination attempt on Hitler inside his Wolf's Lair headquarters. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg managed to smuggle a bomb into the briefing room where Hitler was meeting his officers. Only half of the explosives detonated. 4 Nazis were killed, while Hitler escaped with minor injuries. In retaliation, the regime executed or sent to concentration camps dozens of generals and officials suspected of disloyalty. By the late 1930s, propaganda and the apparent economic success that we now know came at a terrible cost had strengthened the myth of Hitler's genius. Convinced of his own infallibility, he began expanding the Reich even before the Second World War. Through threats and political pressure, he annexed Austria, Czechoslovakia, and the Saar region. Then came his lightning military campaigns. The joint invasion of Poland with the Soviet Union in September 1939 marked the beginning, and within less than 2 years, the Reich and its allies had conquered Denmark, Norway, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Belgium, France,
Romania, Yugoslavia, Greece, and large parts of North Africa. During these rapid conquests, Hitler himself set only the broad strategic directions. The detailed operational planning was handled by the High Command of the German Army, led by Colonel General Franz Halder, a graduate of the military academy and one of the most skilled staff officers of his time.
It's remarkable that Hitler, who would come to command the might of the entire Reich, held only the modest military rank of corporal, just one step above a private. Even before the war began, tensions arose between Hitler and Admiral Erich Raeder, the commander of the German Navy. In 1938, Raeder warned that if war broke out within the next 2 years, the fleet would not be ready. And when the Wehrmacht invaded Poland, he wrote in his diary, "Our surface navy can do nothing now but prove that it knows how to die with honor." As the war against the Soviet Union, launched with such confidence, began to drag on, Hitler's anger turned against his own generals. The first to fall was tank commander General Heinz Wilhelm Guderian. After the Red Army launched its counteroffensive near Moscow, Guderian repeatedly urged Hitler to allow an organized retreat, but his pleas were ignored, and he was dismissed from command. By September 1942, Franz Halder was also removed from his post. Just months later came Stalingrad, and the new chief of the Army General Staff, Kurt Zeitzler, advised a timely withdrawal. But Hitler stubbornly ordered the encircled Sixth Army to hold its ground to the last man, leading to catastrophic consequences. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein later recalled, "We could hardly have foreseen to what extent Hitler would become deaf to all assessments of the real situation, clinging instead to his theory of holding out at any cost. Who could have imagined that for the sake of the name Stalingrad, he would reconcile himself to losing an entire army?" Ironically, the world owes the Third Reich the birth of ballistic missile technology, because German engineering during the war became the foundation of rocketry in both the United States and the Soviet Union. There's a certain irony in the fact that the father of America's space program was once an SS Sturmbannführer, Wernher von Braun, the creator of the V-2 rocket. His work had begun even before the war. In December 1934, the first successful prototype launches took place, and by 1936, construction had begun for a new testing range for the weapon. It wasn't until the autumn of 1942 that the rocket finally achieved a successful launch, flying nearly 200 kilometers. In December of that year, Hitler approved its mass production. By 1943, construction began on 2 massive underground complexes, the La Coupole Dome, intended for launching rockets at London, and the Epelec Bunker for storage and preparation. However, both projects were left unfinished due to relentless Allied bombing. That same summer, after the Reich's failed Operation Citadel at Kursk and the Allies' successful landings in Sicily, Hitler placed his faith in salvation through the creation of his so-called Wunderwaffe, the miracle weapon. But by then, time was working against the Reich.
Resource shortages were mounting, and desperation had set in. The first combat use of the V-2 rockets came in September 1944, when they were fired at London and Paris. Over 7 months of deployment, these weapons, meant to change the course of the war, instead became tools of terror, killing more than 2,500 civilians while achieving nothing on the battlefield. As for Wernher von Braun, the Americans captured him in May 1945 and soon integrated him into their own rocket development program. Germany's Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer, would later reflect on the project. Enormous effort and resources were poured into the development and production of long-range rockets, which by the autumn of 1944 had proven entirely useless. Our most expensive project turned out to be the most senseless. The rockets we were so proud of and to which I once gave priority brought only the waste of money and time. Worse still, they were one of the reasons we lost the air defense war. In June 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy, and among the German forces sent to stop them was the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, formed from 17-year-old boys. Their motto was, "My honor is loyalty," but slogans could not stop the enemy advance. Loyalty, above all else, was what Hitler demanded from his soldiers, even from those completely surrounded. Since 1934, members of the Wehrmacht had sworn their oaths not to Germany, not to the people, but personally to the Führer. By the autumn of 1933, defeat was becoming obvious to many within Hitler's own ranks. While Nazi propaganda continued to glorify past victories and promise salvation through miracle weapons, thoughts of surrender and negotiation were already taking shape among his closest circle. After Hitler's suicide, several of his loyal followers took their own lives as well. Joseph Goebbels, Hans Krebs, Erich Berenfänger. But those were rare exceptions of faithfulness to the end. And even then, was it truly loyalty or merely fear of shame and retribution? When the Reich's final offensive, Spring Awakening, ended in failure, chaos consumed the command structure. Many generals refused to carry out senseless orders, or even led their troops toward American lines to surrender. Albert Speer quietly sabotaged Hitler's scorched earth directive, refusing to destroy Germany's industrial sites before retreating. Heinrich Himmler himself tried to negotiate with the Allies. Furious, Hitler stripped both men of all titles and power just 1 day before taking his own life. But by then, it no longer mattered. What does matter are your thoughts. If you have something to add or disagree with our conclusions, join the discussion in the comments below.